Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corn. So, you know how we mentioned air quality in a few episodes, and I mentioned I installed an app to look at the levels? Well, guess what the levels are today in Jerusalem? Oh my gosh, it's gone up again. 838 is the AQI, and the PM 2.5 is 495. Holy moly. That's the highest I've ever seen it. And it's like this all over the country, but especially here. The reason is there is a sandstorm in progress. You can literally look out the window and practically feel the grit in your throat. And Hannah even thinks that there may be some dust in our apartment that literally came from the sandstorm and is already there. So I'd love to ask you, Herman and Corn, these events are not that... Thank goodness this isn't the typical air quality we live with. Needless to say, I've got my PM 2.5 on, besides being waking up with a cold and listening to Papa Berry's advice about donning one if you're spending any time with an infant. I'm also not going outside today. This is one of those few days where I don't think it's even up for discussion whether you have a mask or not. What I'd love to ask you about, though, Herman and Corn, is these sandstorms we get in this part of the world periodically and the amount of dust that they kick up. We have these communities like the Bedouin who live in the desert. That's their natural habitat. And my question always is, are sandstorms a constant feature of life in the desert? And if so, how do these guys adapt? Like, if you live in that kind of environment, does your immune system just react from birth to not react in any way to the presence of levels of sand in the air that for a non-desert dwelling person, especially someone like me who grew up in Ireland where, you know, sandstorms just didn't exist, do they get some kind of immunity from birth just by growing up with that environment? And I think as much as it's a niche question, it brings us to an important topic, which is that whatever your local allergens are in Ireland, let's say we have a lot of damp, probably a good amount of mold. Does your body naturally grow up with some protections around that? Because in Ireland, where I grew up, in Cork specifically, there's a remarkably high level of asthma, and there's always been this question mark about whether it's tied to industrial activity and, I believe, Ringaskiddy in particular, and there's always been this question mark hanging over it, and I think there's some evidence substantiating this. So, Herman and Corn, as we stay indoors and look at the almost apocalyptic side of the orange sky from the sandstorm in progress here, I wonder, how do folks who grew up in that environment actually manage? And I presume they don't just spend their lives breathing through whatever I'm wearing in N95. Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and if you are listening to this in real time, or if you happen to be looking out a window in Jerusalem today, on this Saturday, February 14th, 2026, you know exactly why we are huddled indoors with the air purifiers on blast. The sky is a surreal, apocalyptic shade of orange. It feels like we are living on Mars, but with significantly more humidity and a very scratchy throat.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say I have been checking the sensors every 10 minutes. Our housemate Daniel sent us a voice note earlier today, and he was not kidding about those numbers. An air quality index of 838? That is not just bad, that is off the charts. For context, anything over 300 is considered hazardous. We are nearly triple that. My personal laser particle counter is actually struggling to calibrate because the density of the particulate matter is so high.
It is intense. Daniel mentioned he could feel the grit in his throat just looking out the window, and I think we are all feeling that. It is that specific kind of dust storm we get here, the Sharav or the Khamsin, as it is often called. The word Khamsin actually means 50 in Arabic, referring to the 50-day period in the spring and autumn when these winds are most prevalent. It brings this fine powdery silt from the Sahara or the Arabian desert, and it just hangs there. But Daniel's prompt really got me thinking about the human element of this. We are sitting here in a modern apartment with N95 masks and high-tech HEPA filters, but people have lived in these deserts for thousands of years.
Daniel's prompt was quite specific. He was asking about the Bedouin communities and how they adapt. Is this a constant feature of life? Do they just get used to it? And that fascinating question about the immune system. Do you develop a kind of biological immunity to sand if you were born into it? It is such a great angle because it combines anthropology, architecture, and biology. Daniel is originally from Cork, Ireland, so for him, this orange sky is basically a horror movie. In Cork, the biggest respiratory threat is usually dampness and mold, not a wall of mineral dust.
Well, let us start with the frequency. Is this a constant thing? Because, to us, it feels like a major event. But if you are living in the heart of the Negev or the Sinai, is this just Tuesday?
It is more seasonal than constant, but it is frequent enough to dictate the entire rhythm of life. These storms usually peak during the transition seasons. That is when the pressure systems shift and you get these powerful low-pressure cells moving across North Africa. In the desert, you do not just have the sand on the ground, you have what we call saltation. That is a term from the Latin saltare, meaning to jump. When the wind hits about 15 miles per hour, it picks up larger grains and they hop along the surface. When they land, they smash into other grains, kicking up the much finer dust. The particulate matter, 2.5 and 10, that Daniel was worried about.
Right, and that fine dust can travel thousands of miles. I remember reading that Saharan dust actually fertilizes the Amazon rainforest because it is so rich in phosphorus and iron. But if you are a Bedouin herder in the middle of it, you are not thinking about the Amazon. You are thinking about your lungs and your livestock. So, how do they actually manage? Daniel asked about masks, but you do not typically see traditional desert dwellers wearing medical-grade respirators.
No, but they have something that has been engineered over centuries to perform a similar function. Think about the Keffiyeh or the shamag. We often see it as a cultural symbol or just a piece of clothing, but it is a highly sophisticated piece of desert technology. When a sandstorm hits, you do not just wrap it loosely. There is a specific way to layer it over the nose and mouth. The folds of the fabric create a labyrinth for the air to travel through.
That is interesting. So it is not just a single layer of cloth, it is about the geometry of the wrap.
That's right. As you breathe through those layers of cotton or wool, the larger dust particles get trapped in the fibers through a process called inertial impaction. But even more importantly, the moisture from your breath slightly dampens the fabric. That creates a humid microclimate right in front of your airways. This does two things. It helps trap even finer particles that would otherwise fly right in, and it prevents your mucous membranes from drying out. In a sandstorm, the air is incredibly dry, often below 10% humidity. If your throat and nose dry out, the protective cilia stop moving, the tissue cracks, and that is how you get infections.
So the Keffiyeh is essentially a reusable, washable, multifunctional air filter. And it covers the neck and head too, which prevents the sand from sandblasting your skin. I imagine the traditional robes, the abayas or thobes, work in a similar way.
They do. They are loose-fitting for a reason. They allow air to circulate around the body for cooling, but the density of the weave is designed to keep the fine silt out. But the adaptation goes beyond clothing. It is in the architecture. Daniel mentioned living in an apartment, but traditional Bedouin tents, the Beit al-Shar or House of Hair, are marvels of material science.
I have always been fascinated by those. They are usually black, right? Which seems counterintuitive in the heat.
It does, but there is a brilliant mechanism at play. They are woven from goat hair. When it is dry and dusty, the weave has tiny microscopic gaps that allow for ventilation. But the fibers themselves are oily and coarse, so they deflect the bulk of the blowing sand. If it rains, the fibers swell and the tent becomes waterproof. During a sandstorm, the Bedouin would drop the flaps and orient the tent away from the wind. The interior becomes a relatively still pocket of air. Because the dust is heavy, it settles quickly if the air is not moving. So, by creating a dead air zone, they let the storm pass over them while the dust drops to the floor of the tent rather than staying suspended in their breathing zone.
That makes sense. It is about managing the physics of the environment rather than trying to fight it with a solid wall. But let us get to the biology, because this is where Daniel's question got really interesting. He mentioned growing up in Cork, Ireland, where it is damp and moldy, and how that might affect asthma rates. Then he asked if people born in the desert develop an immunity to sand. Herman, can you actually be immune to a physical irritant like sand?
This is a nuance we need to be careful with. You cannot really be immune to sand in the way you are immune to a virus. Sand and dust are physical particulates. If they get into your lungs, they cause inflammation. There is a condition called desert lung, or non-occupational silicosis, which has been documented in populations living in high dust environments. It is also known as Al-Qasimi syndrome. So, it is not that they have magical lungs that do not care about sand. In fact, long-term exposure to heavy dust can lead to fibrosis or scarring of the lung tissue.
Okay, so it is not a superpower, but is there a difference in how their immune systems react compared to someone like Daniel, who grew up in a completely different climate?
There certainly is, and it likely comes down to the hygiene hypothesis and mucosal adaptation. Our immune systems are trained by our environment from the moment we are born. In a place like the desert, infants are exposed to a very specific set of minerals, fungi, and bacteria that live on those dust particles. There is evidence that this early exposure can desensitize the immune system to certain triggers.
So, while my body might see a Saharan dust grain and go into full-scale inflammatory panic-producing mucus, making me cough, triggering an asthma attack, someone who grew up with it might have a more measured response.
That's the key. It is about the threshold of reactivity. Their bodies have learned that this level of particulate matter is a baseline feature of the world, not necessarily a pathogen to be fought with maximum force. There is also the factor of mucosal immunity. The lining of the nose and throat can actually thicken or change the composition of the mucus to be more effective at trapping and clearing these specific types of minerals. The mucociliary escalator, that is the tiny hairs in your lungs that move mucus up and out, becomes highly efficient at dealing with mineral dust.
That is fascinating. So it is less like a vaccine and more like a callus on a hand. The body builds up a structural and chemical tolerance. But Daniel's point about Ireland is a great counterexample. He mentioned high asthma rates in Cork. Ireland actually has one of the highest rates of asthma in the world. It is interesting how every environment has its own invisible tax on the respiratory system.
It really does. In Ireland, you are dealing with mold spores, high humidity, and dust mites. Those are biological allergens. In the desert, you have mineral dust. Both can lead to chronic respiratory issues, but the body adapts to the one it knows. There was a study I read a while back comparing respiratory health in desert-dwelling nomads versus urban dwellers in the same region. Interestingly, the nomads often had better lung function despite the dust, partly because they were not also breathing in the nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide from city traffic.
Right. So the sand itself is one thing, but when you mix it with urban pollution, like we have here in Jerusalem today, it becomes a much nastier cocktail. That is probably why the air quality index is hitting those 800 plus numbers. It is the natural dust combined with the anthropogenic stuff that is trapped in the stagnant air.
You've got it. When a dust particle travels over a city, it acts like a tiny sponge. It picks up heavy metals, exhaust fumes, and industrial chemicals. So when you breathe in that sand, you are actually breathing in a chemical delivery system. For someone like Daniel, or even for us, who might not have that lifelong mucosal adaptation to this specific density of dust, our bodies are essentially overreacting. We are experiencing that scratchy throat and the coughing because our systems are trying to flush out something they perceive as a major threat.
It makes me wonder about the long-term shifts. We are in February 2026, and it feels like these storms are becoming more frequent, or at least more intense. If the climate continues to desertify certain regions, are we going to see a global shift in how human lungs function? Are we all going to have to adapt like the Bedouin?
It is a real possibility. We are already seeing an increase in the frequency of dust events reaching southern Europe and even the Americas. There is this concept of the great acceleration of dust. As soil dries out due to rising temperatures and changing land use, there is more material available for the wind to grab. We might all need to start looking at traditional desert clothing and architecture for lessons on how to live in a dustier world. The Sahara is expanding southward into the Sahel, and the Dust Belt is widening.
I can see it now. Herman Poppleberry in a high-tech carbon fiber Keffiyeh. But seriously, the traditional wisdom is so often overlooked. We think we need a machine to solve a problem that a well-folded piece of cloth has been handling for 2,000 years.
That's a good point. It is the difference between active and passive technology. An air purifier is active. It requires power and filters. A Keffiyeh or a goat hair tint is passive. It works because of its inherent properties. For a nomadic community, passive technology is the only thing that makes sense. You cannot carry a HEPA filter across the dunes. And let us not forget the animals. Daniel asked how they manage. Look at the camel. They have 3 eyelids and 2 rows of extra long lashes to protect their eyes. They can voluntarily close their nostrils to keep the sand out. Humans do not have those biological features, so we had to invent the Keffiyeh to do it for us.
You know, Daniel also mentioned the grit in the apartment. Even with the windows closed, that fine silt finds its way in. It is almost like a liquid. It gets through the smallest cracks.
It absolutely is. On a microscopic level, those particles are jagged and tiny. They can penetrate seals that would stop water. That is why the Bedouin method of creating that still air zone is so much more effective than just trying to seal a box. You cannot win a war of attrition against dust. You have to let it settle. In a modern apartment, the air is constantly being moved by air conditioners or fans, which keeps the dust suspended. If you want the dust to stop being in your lungs, you have to let the air be still.
I think there is a broader lesson there about resilience versus resistance. We tend to want to resist our environment, to build walls, to wear masks, to filter everything out. But the adaptation Daniel is asking about is more about resilience. It is about the body and the culture finding a way to exist within the storm.
I love that distinction. Resistance is brittle. If your mask breaks or your power goes out, you are vulnerable. Resilience is flexible. It is the mucosal lining of your throat getting a bit tougher. It is the way you wrap your scarf. It is knowing when to stay still and let the dust settle. It is about working with the physics of the world rather than pretending you can shut it out.
It also makes me think about the psychological aspect. When I look out and see that orange sky, I feel a sense of dread. It looks like the end of the world. But if you grew up in a community where this is a seasonal cycle, is that dread replaced by a kind of respect or even a ritual?
It certainly is. There are traditional stories and prayers specifically for these winds. In many desert cultures, the wind is seen as a cleansing force, even if it is difficult to live through. It moves the sands. It changes the landscape. It signals the coming of a new season. There is a deep psychological anchoring that happens when you are in tune with the environment's harshest moods. You do not panic because you know the cycle. You know that after the Khamsin, the air eventually clears.
It is funny, Daniel's mention of Ireland made me realize that we all have our own version of this. In Ireland, you probably do not even think about the rain after a certain point. It is just the background noise of life. Yeah, the sharav is that background noise for many, even if it feels like a crisis to us.
That's right. And to answer Daniel's question about the immune system one more time, it is worth noting that while they might have a higher tolerance for the irritation, desert communities still suffer from the physical effects. It is not a free pass. They have just optimized their lifestyle to minimize the damage. They stay indoors, they cover up, they move less. They respect the storm. They drink plenty of water and tea to keep those mucous membranes hydrated from the inside out.
So the takeaway for Daniel, and for us, honestly, is that we are not going to wake up tomorrow with sandproof lungs. But we can learn from the Bedouin. Maybe it is time to invest in some high-quality linen wraps and stop trying to fight the desert with just an air conditioner.
And maybe keep that N95 handy for the days when the AQI hits 800. Traditional wisdom is great, but modern science has its place when the dust is mixed with city smog. We are living in a hybrid world now, where we need both the ancient scarf and the modern filter.
That's a fair point. I think we have covered the bases here, from the physics of goat hair to the callouses on our mucosal membranes. It is a reminder of how incredibly plastic the human body is.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.